Hi, as Scott said, this is On My Nightstand, and I am Laura Cathcart Robbins. And today we're bringing you a book by Carla D. Williams. It's called Blues Highway, A Migration Journey from the South to Chicago. And Carla wrote me an inscription. She sent me this book. It was a submission. And it says, "Dear Laura, enjoy your podcast so much. Please enjoy having my book on my nightstand." And then she signed her name, Carla Williams. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She began writing as a teenager in Chicago and later became a newspaper editor and humanities educator. As a fellow in the Bay Area Writing Project Summer Institute in 2010, she produced memoir, fiction, poetry, and more. Her fiction and poetry have appeared in e-zines, Digital Paper, Poetry Express, Dillydoun Review, and elsewhere. And this book, Blues Highway, is about the migration. It's one migration story of Blacks from the American South, and it's often called the Great Migration, when Blacks left the South and went to different metropolises, aided by Pullman porters, she mentions here. And this is a story about a family that moved to Chicago. Right now we're with Janet. Her mother bakes and sells pies, and she is responsible for delivering the pies in the neighborhood and getting the money. And right now where we are, this is chapter 7, chapter 8, Chicago 1967. Where we are now is she's kind of working on her salesmanship. As she got more confident with her pitches, she also started to juggle orders in her head quickly when talking to customers. There was that time when she was sent by Mrs. Johnson's one Saturday morning and saw that she was setting up for her husband's regular card party. Mrs. Johnson's husband maintained buses for the Chicago Transit Authority. That meant at least 2 card tables set up for CTA buddies, and maybe even a third one for a few wives showing up to gossip and knit. Janet realized that she needed more than one pie and offered that. Besides the pumpkin, you could try a key lime pie that Mama just started making. The key lime pie wasn't rightly meant for Mrs. Johnson, but the way Janet saw it, Mrs. Johnson would be a better customer down the road if she got a taste of something new. Problem was, Mrs. Johnson was a bit of a talker. And when Mrs. Johnson was taking out the trash at one point, she ran across the alleyway to chat with Mrs. Davenport. Mrs. Davenport had been expecting that same key lime pie on that Saturday, but Janet had claimed she couldn't get her pie until Sunday. Well, when Mrs. Johnson blabbed about the key lime pie she was getting for her husband's card party, Mrs. Davenport got angry. She told Janet she ought to whip her for passing the story and that she would wait for her pie while Mrs. Johnson was steady eating it. Janet made a note to herself to never cross Mrs. Davenport again and figured she would make it up to her in some kind of way. Unfortunately, by the time she got home, Mrs. Davenport had already sent her son James around to tell Mama about the key lime pie. Janet's mother was none too happy to hear from a client that she had not got her order straight. As Janet arrived home, her mother asked if everything was okay, as Janet sat down to count the money. At that point, Janet mentioned to her mother, as though it had just come to her, that Mrs. Davenport would need a, quote, extra key lime pie, unquote. Why would she need another pie, and on a Sunday? Her mother asked. I don't know, Janet mused. Guess the flavor suited her. Maybe it was the cinnamon you put into the graham cracker crust. Lula nearly dropped the pan of melted butter in her hand. Did she tell you that? Janet thought about how to put it. Kind of. She said she really needed it. Really? She told me she needed it yesterday, Lula paused. Her boy James came over here looking for it just now. Janet paused in counting the singles, but did not look up to see her mother's face. She did? When did y'all talk? 'Cause she seemed happy enough when I told her the pie would come to her after service. Lula stopped mashing the lime pulp, leaned over, and smacked her hard across the face. So hard, the few bills flew off the table. So are you telling me Mrs. Davenport is a lie? Huh? Is that it? You're so smart you know better than her? Or is you lying? Janet finally looked up. Her mother slapped her again on the arm. For a moment, Janet held her face and thought her mother really had lost her mind. She could not conceive of any reason for her flying so high off the handle. She had not left the door open at night, or left the gas burning in the front heater in the morning. Her room was mostly clean. She had not taken any money from her mom's purse without asking. Her uniform was already hand-washed and hanging on the line near the water heater. Why did her mother slap her? Lula told her how it was. You're the helper in this pie business, so don't mess it up with any of my clients. If you do what you say and mean it, people will trust you with it. But me, I gotta go get me a daughter who thinks she knows so goddamn much. I gotta hear from a boy down the street that his mama thinks her pie was ate over by Mrs. Johnson's. Janet was wiping the sting out of her eyes and said nothing. She waited while her mother told her again what her job was. You're supposed to carry the pies and pick up the payment. No money, no pie. Match the order to the person. Take the next one and offer the new one I'm trying. Then move on and be home for supper. You get it, don't you? Yes, Mama. Do I need to tell you again? No, Mama. Good girl. You know you have to pay for this mistake. 2 weeks' pay will cover it. Wordless, Janet got down off the stool and took her savings jar down and passed $3 to her mother. She wanted to tell her mama that if she'd let her, she could have gotten Mrs. Davenport to buy 2 pies out of envy for Mrs. Johnson's card party. Her mouth was so sore, though, she kept it shut, moving on to her next task, then stopping briefly to apologize. Mama, I guess I didn't think Mrs. Davenport would be upset. I didn't think like that. You thought all right, but you got it all wrong. Daughter, no woman wants to think about how another woman has something she wanted and should have had but didn't get. Lula smiled and laughed at her. One day, when you've grown up, you'll learn that that's true about most everything to do with men and pies. I'm saving you time by keeping you from learning it the hard way. That Sunday, Janet did not even try to apologize after Bible school to Mrs. Davenport, who took a free extra apple pie from Janet with a smug grin. I told Mrs. Johnson you a pie lie, Mrs. Davenport told her. Lucky for you, your mama is as straight as they come.